Today we have a story about a woman whose name was never printed in the papers of her town, yet whose life was quietly recorded in ledgers never meant to be read. This account was recovered from a damaged bundle of employment records and personal statements found behind a false wall in a county archive. If you found value in this narration, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. The woman's name was Evelyn Carter. She lived in a small American mill town tucked between a river bend and low wooded hills, a place where mornings smelled of damp earth and coal smoke. Evelyn was a humble woman, known for her steady manners and gentle voice. She rose before daylight, warmed water on her stove, and walked the same narrow road to work each morning with her lunch wrapped in cloth beneath her arm. On Sundays, she sang softly in the back pew of the church and greeted others with a smile that carried no demand. Evelyn worked at the Bellamore Textile Mill, a red brick building that dominated the edge of town like a watchful presence. The mill employed many, but it was governed by one man, Mr. Harold Whitcomb, the overseer. Whitcomb was known for his precise habits and his belief that order must be maintained at all costs. He spoke politely, yet never warmly, and his eyes lingered on people longer than was comfortable. From her first week, Evelyn noticed rules that were never written down. Certain workers were told to remain after the final whistle without explanation. Questions about wages were discouraged. Conversations near the records office were abruptly interrupted. Names occasionally vanished from the daily rolls, not crossed out, but erased so thoroughly they appeared never to have existed. The mill itself seemed to follow patterns. The lower floor was always colder, even in summer. Lamps there burned dimmer. At times Evelyn heard a soft, rhythmic tapping beneath the floorboards, slow and deliberate, like something being counted out of sight. When she once mentioned the sound to another worker, the woman stiffened and quietly warned her never to speak of it again. In the final entry of her earliest statement, Evelyn wrote a single line, pressed firmly into the page as if to steady her hand. There are rules here that do not serve work. They serve something else, something, she believed, was already watching. The first conflict appears in the record without raised voices or public scene. It is noted only as a correction request, dated in Evelyn Carter's careful hand. Her wages for that week were short. Evelyn waited until the noon bell had passed and approached the small office near the mill's eastern wall. She removed her hat before stepping inside. As was expected, Mr. Harold Whitcomb sat behind his desk, reviewing the day's entries with a ruler aligned precisely along the ledger's edge. A young clerk stood nearby, ink-stained and silent. Evelyn spoke respectfully. She said there must have been a mistake. She had worked every assigned hour. She asked only for the record to be checked. Whitcomb did not look up at first. When he did, his expression held no anger, only a mild curiosity, as though she had spoken out of turn rather than in error. He told her the ledger was accurate. The mill did not make mistakes. If her pay was less, it was because she had earned less. Evelyn asked softly if she might see the entry. The room grew still. The clerk stopped writing. Whitcomb closed the ledger with deliberate care and placed his hand upon it, not possessively, but protectively. He said the records were not meant for discussion. He added gently that questions such as hers often led to misunderstandings. Misunderstandings led to reassignment. The following morning, Evelyn's name appeared beside a new position. Lower floor. No explanation was given. The lower floor felt different from the first hour she stepped onto it. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic scent. The machines were older, their movements uneven, producing sounds that overlapped in uneasy rhythms. The women working there kept their eyes forward. None spoke unless addressed. Near the end of the day, a supervisor informed Evelyn she would remain after the final whistle to finish her quota. When the mill emptied, silence pressed in heavily. The lamps flickered. Beneath the floorboards the tapping began again, slow, steady, and patient. Evelyn counted without meaning to. Whitcomb returned just as dusk settled. He did not ask what she had heard. He only reminded her that cooperation was noticed and resistance remembered. That evening, while washing her hands, Evelyn saw a faint mark on her skin. It resembled a small inked line, as though drawn by accident. She scrubbed until her hands reddened. The mark remained. In her statement, she ended the day with a note written smaller than the rest. I believe the ledger is not merely keeping time, it is keeping people. The changes came quietly, as most lasting things in the mill did. They were not announced. They were simply present, as though they had always been so, and memory itself had been mistaken before. New instructions circulated without paper. Certain stairwells were no longer to be used. A door near the dye room was kept locked at all hours, though Evelyn remembered it once standing open. The lower floor lamps were lit earlier now, even when daylight still reached the windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the brick. The tapping beneath the floorboards began to follow a pattern. Every seventh evening, just after the final whistle should have sounded, it returned, slow, deliberate, never hurried. Evelyn noticed that on those nights, at least one worker from the lower floor would not appear the following morning. Their station would be cleared, their tools reassigned. Their name would vanish from the roll as if it had never been written. Whispers moved through the mill like drafts through cracks. No one spoke openly, yet glances lingered longer. Some women began bringing extra food, but never ate it. Others wore their coats indoors, regardless of the heat. It was during this time that Lillian Brooks, a seamstress whose hands trembled even when still, began to watch Evelyn closely. Lillian never addressed her directly, but one afternoon, as they passed near the wash basin, she pressed a folded scrap of paper into Evelyn's palm. Inside were only 3 words, written unevenly. They keep records below. That night, Evelyn heard something new beneath the tapping, a dragging sound, brief and quickly silenced. She woke before dawn with the certainty that someone had spoken her name, though she could not recall the voice. The following week, Evelyn noticed gaps in the ledger when she passed the records office. Pages were missing, removed cleanly, leaving no torn edges behind. A locked door now stood where a storage room had once been. When she asked the clerk about it, he stared past her and said he had no memory of such a room. Whitcomb's attention shifted. He no longer corrected Evelyn. Instead, he observed her. He began assigning her tasks that took her near the locked areas, watching carefully to see where her eyes rested. Once she caught him counting softly under his breath while marking the book. Evelyn's dreams grew heavy and repetitive, rows of names written in ink that bled through paper, lines drawn beside them, a voice whispering numbers she could not remember upon waking. In her statement, written with growing urgency, Evelyn noted something she could not explain, but could no longer ignore. The mill is not producing cloth alone. It is producing absence, and it is learning how much we will surrender before we notice. The breaking point did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It came in the form of a name. Evelyn found it by accident while assisting near the records office, sent there under the pretense of sorting unused materials. The ledger lay open on the desk, its pages weighted flat by a brass ruler. She had no intention of looking, yet her eyes were drawn to a familiar hand. Martha Carter, her sister. Martha had never worked at the Bellamore Mill. She lived 2 towns away, took in sewing, and cared for their aging aunt. The sight of her name written cleanly, followed by a small inked mark identical to the one on Evelyn's hand, left Evelyn unable to breathe. She closed the ledger carefully, as though it might react to her fear. That evening Evelyn requested a meeting with Mr. Harold Whitcomb. She stood straight in his office, hands folded, voice steady despite the weight pressing against her chest. She told him there must be a mistake. Her sister did not belong to the mill. Her sister was not a worker. Whitcomb listened in silence. Then he sighed, as though disappointed rather than threatened. He explained calmly that the mill did not only record labor, it recorded obligation. Families were efficient units. When one member benefited from steady work, the balance extended outward. When one questioned authority, the balance required adjustment. He said names were not invitations, they were forecasts. If Evelyn wished her sister's name to remain theoretical, she would return to her station and cease her inquiries. If not, arrangements could be made. The threat was delivered without cruelty. That was what made it unbearable. Evelyn left the office shaking. In her room that night, she sat on her bed until the lamp burned low, staring at her hands. The ink line on her skin had darkened. She thought of Martha's laugh, of borrowed needles and shared meals, of a life lived quietly beyond the mill's reach. Until now, fear filled her, but beneath it grew something firmer, resolve. Evelyn began to write differently after that night. The careful politeness of earlier entries gave way to precision. She noted dates, sounds, patterns, and absences. She described Whitcomb's language and the way the ledger seemed to grow heavier with use. In one passage, written with remarkable calm, she confessed her realization. This place does not need chains. It needs silence. The moment I understood that I understood my choice, she would not run. She would not beg. If the mill kept records, she would keep them too. The final line of this section is underlined twice. The paper creased from pressure. They believe fear will make me small. They do not yet understand what fear can make me careful enough to become. Evelyn Carter did not act quickly. Her strength, as the record shows, lay in patience. She understood now that haste was what the mill expected. Panic led workers to vanish. Silence allowed the machine to continue uninterrupted. So she learned. She learned which nights the tapping beneath the floor grew louder, and which nights it did not come at all. She learned that Whitcomb never descended below the mill alone, and that the locked door near the dye room was opened only after the 7th evening bell. She learned that the clerk altered entries only after Whitcomb had marked them first. Most importantly, she learned how the ledger was kept. Evelyn discovered that the book was not stored in one place. The public ledger remained in the office, clean and orderly, but beneath the mill floor existed a second record, older, heavier, bound in cracked leather. It contained names written in a different hand, some crossed through, others marked with symbols that mirrored the ink lines appearing on workers' skin. With the help of Lillian Brooks, whose quiet courage revealed itself in small acts, Evelyn began copying what she could. Lillian distracted supervisors. She carried folded pages inside hems and linings. Neither woman spoke of it aloud. An unexpected ally emerged in the form of Daniel Reeves, the town registrar, a man nearing the end of his service. Evelyn approached him with courtesy and evidence, never accusation. She showed him dates that did not align, labor totals that exceeded possibility, and names that appeared in both civic and mill records without explanation. Reeves recognized old practices. He recalled outdated labor clauses that had never been formally abolished, only ignored. Clauses that allowed private enterprises disturbing authority over dependents. Whitcomb sensed the shift before he understood it. He began assigning Evelyn tasks meant to isolate her. He watched her with interest rather than suspicion. Once he remarked that she had become very attentive to detail, as though it were a compliment. Meanwhile, the ledger beneath the floor grew thicker. Evelyn wrote that hope entered her cautiously, like light through a cracked door. She knew exposure would not end the mill's appetite, but it might interrupt its rhythm. An interruption, she believed, was the one thing it could not tolerate. Still, dread followed every step. The tapping grew irregular. New names appeared overnight. One morning, Lillian did not arrive at her station. Evelyn noted this absence with a trembling hand, then forced herself to continue. The last lines of this part are stained, possibly from water or tears. I have learned enough to know this. The mill is not afraid of justice. It is afraid of being seen, and now it knows that I am watching it back. Evelyn chose the moment with care. The record makes clear that she waited not for courage, but for alignment. The tapping had fallen silent for 3 consecutive nights. Whitcomb's attention had shifted toward production delays. The ledger beneath the mill had not been updated since Lillian Brooks vanished. On the 4th morning, Evelyn walked to the county office. She did not arrive in distress. She did not accuse. She presented documents to Daniel Reeves, and later to 2 visiting inspectors whose presence had already unsettled the town. She offered copies of labor tallies that exceeded the number of registered workers. She showed names that appeared in municipal rolls without corresponding residences. She described rules that were enforced without notice and punishments that left no trace. Reeves submitted the complaint formally. Whitcomb responded with composure. He welcomed inspection. He spoke of efficiency, of misunderstood customs, of the mill's importance to the town's survival. He denied the existence of any secondary records. The inspectors requested access to the lower floor. For the first time, Whitcomb hesitated. They descended together, lamps held high. The air below was heavy and wet, and the walls bore marks where shelves had once been removed. Beneath loose planks, the inspectors discovered ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, stacked with care. Names filled the pages in faded ink, symbols repeated with mathematical precision. One inspector paused and remarked that the mill sounded quieter than expected. Then the tapping resumed. It echoed through the beams, louder than Evelyn had ever heard it, as though responding to presence rather than time. One inspector stepped back. Another dropped his lamp. Whitcomb attempted explanation. He spoke too quickly. His words overlapped. Cracks formed. Records did not align. Witnesses contradicted his statements. Reeves produced older statutes that revealed how such practices had once been permitted and quietly outlawed. Power shifted not with outrage but with paperwork. Whitcomb was suspended pending review. The mill was ordered closed until its records could be reconciled. That night, Evelyn returned home exhausted but alert. She did not celebrate. She listened. For the first time since her employment began, there was no tapping. In her final entry for that week, she wrote with restraint that the mill's silence felt unnatural, like a held breath. She ended with a warning rather than relief. The machine has been interrupted. That does not mean it has been dismantled. Things that learn to count do not forget how simply because someone closes the book. The reckoning took place in the town hall, a building meant for sermons, hearings, and harvest meetings, never for the unearthing of quiet crimes. The benches were filled, though the crowd spoke little. Word had traveled carefully, carried by looks rather than voices. Mr. Harold Whitcomb stood at the front, composed but diminished. The careful posture remained, yet something behind it had loosened. The ledger, now sealed in evidence cloth, rested on the table between him and the council like a weight no one wished to touch. Evelyn Carter was called last. She walked forward without hesitation, her hands steady at her sides. She did not raise her voice. She did not seek sympathy. Her testimony was delivered as one might read a list of dates or weather patterns. She spoke of rules that were never written, of hours that vanished from pay, of names that disappeared without farewell. She described the tapping beneath the mill, the markings on workers' hands, and the second ledger hidden from daylight. She spoke of her sister's name appearing without consent. Whitcomb interrupted once. He said the mill followed tradition, that families had always been accounted for in such ways, that order required sacrifice, that chaos followed questioning. Evelyn turned to him then. She asked him to explain the symbols beside the names. She asked him to explain why no bodies were recorded, only absences. She asked him why the ledger beneath the floor was older than the mill itself. Whitcomb could not answer. When the sealed records were opened, a murmur passed through the room. Some names were known. Some belonged to women long assumed to have moved on. Others belonged to people still present, still breathing. The most chilling discovery lay at the ledger's final pages. The tally marks did not stop. They extended beyond recorded dates, continuing forward into blank space, as though the mill had expected more names to come. A councilman asked what would have happened had the practice continued. Evelyn answered before Whitcomb could speak. She said it would have grown efficient. It would have expanded quietly. It would have learned how to take without being noticed at all. Whitcomb's composure finally broke. He insisted he had only maintained what he inherited, that the system predated him, that it would outlast him. In that moment, the true antagonist revealed itself. It was not a man. It was a mechanism built from obedience and fear. The hearing ended without spectacle. Whitcomb was removed. The mill was condemned. As Evelyn left the hall, she noted one final detail. The ledger, when closed, still felt warm. The records do not describe celebration. They describe quiet. In the weeks following the hearing, the Bellamore Textile Mill stood sealed, its windows dark, its doors chained. Grass began to grow between the stones of its yard. The river nearby continued its course, indifferent to the structure that had once leaned so heavily upon the town. Mr. Harold Whitcomb disappeared from public life. Some said he relocated. Others said he remained nearby, living under a different name. The documents make no effort to follow him. Authority, once stripped, ceased to matter. The ledger did not vanish. It was transferred to county storage, sealed under legal order. Yet the final archival note records an odd detail. When the book was catalogued, its weight was found to be greater than expected, as though more pages lay within than could be seen. The clerk responsible for its filing requested reassignment the following week. No explanation was given. Evelyn Carter returned to ordinary life. She left mill work entirely, taking in laundry and mending once more. She attended church without drawing attention, and sang as she always had, softly and without performance. Her sister Martha's name was never again found in any record beyond census rolls and letters sent between towns. The inked mark on Evelyn's hand faded over time, though never fully disappeared. In her final statement, written years later and added to the archive by an unknown hand, Evelyn reflected not on fear, but on endurance. She wrote that justice did not arrive as a triumph, but as a release. The absence of the tapping was not peace, but permission to rest. She warned future readers not to mistake quiet systems for harmless ones. She wrote that cruelty does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it counts patiently, waiting for silence to do its work. The last line of her testimony is written in older ink, the script slower, the pressure lighter. What I survived did not seek my pain. It sought my compliance. When I refused that, it had nothing left to take. The archive note that follows is unsigned. It states that the mill was later dismantled and its materials sold. No further records of disappearance connected to it were found. However, the note also remarks that on certain evenings, long after the building was gone, residents reported hearing a faint, rhythmic tapping near the riverbank. These reports were not investigated. The final sentence of the archive is underlined once. Some systems are not destroyed. They are only interrupted, waiting for someone else to forget.